The life of Moses, faith, leadership, and God's promise. The journey of Moses isn't just a story from the past. It's a living example of what it means to walk in faith, trust in God's promises, and lead with courage. Do you ever feel like you're facing an impossible situation? Maybe you're standing at a crossroads in your life, unsure of which direction to take. Maybe you've experienced moments of doubt, wondering if God's promises are still meant for you. Or perhaps you've been called to lead, whether it's in your home, your community, or even at work, and the weight of responsibility feels overwhelming. If any of this resonates with you, I want you to take a moment and think about this. Moses was no different from us. The story of Moses is not just ancient history, it's a roadmap for anyone who has ever felt unworthy, uncertain, or unable to fulfill the calling God has placed on their life. Moses, born into a time of oppression, grew up with an identity crisis. He ran from his calling, doubted his ability, and made mistakes along the way. Yet God took this imperfect man and used him to change the course of history, freeing an entire nation and leading them into the promised land. The life of Moses is a beautiful and powerful reminder that God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called. When you feel small, when your faith wavers, when you're uncertain of the future, God still has a plan for you. In fact, it's in those very moments of weakness that his power shines brightest. Throughout Moses' journey, we see three core elements that defined his life: faith, leadership, and God's promise. These are the same elements that God wants to cultivate in us today. Faith. Moses had to learn to trust God, sometimes even when it didn't make sense. From the burning bush to the Red Sea, his journey was one of constant trust in the God who had promised to deliver his people. Leadership. Moses was called to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, but his leadership wasn't about being a perfect man. It was about being obedient to God's voice, standing firm in the face of opposition, and showing mercy when the people failed. God's promise. Even when the road ahead seemed long and uncertain, Moses clung to God's promises. His life reminds us that God always keeps his word, even when we don't see the full picture. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. What if we lived our lives with the same courage, faith, and trust in God's promises that Moses did? How might our lives be different if we followed his example and stepped out in faith, no matter the obstacles? How could we lead those around us with the same humility and obedience that Moses demonstrated time and time again? As we journey through the life of Moses today, I want you to not only reflect on his story, but to ask yourself, how does God want to use me? What is he calling me to do? And how can I trust in his promises, just as Moses did? The story of Moses is a story of transformation. It's a story of someone who was just like you and me, facing fears, doubts, and struggles, and yet became one of the greatest leaders in history. It's a story that speaks to us today. So let's dive into it and discover the timeless truths that can guide us on our own journey of faith, leadership, and trust in God's promises. Are you ready? Let's walk through this journey together. Part 1. Moses' early life. Born for a purpose. Imagine being born into a world where you have no voice. Your people are oppressed, enslaved, and treated as less than human. That was the reality for Moses. Born in a time when Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, feared the growing population of Israelites, he ordered every Hebrew baby boy to be killed. Can you imagine the fear and uncertainty that filled the hearts of parents during this time? The Israelites were living under the harshest conditions, enslaved, oppressed, and with no hope of a better future. But Moses was born into this broken world for a purpose. You might be thinking, how could God allow such terrible things to happen? But here's the thing. Even in the midst of suffering and hardship, God has a plan. Moses' birth was not by accident. He was born during the darkest of times, but even then, God's hand was at work. Moses' mother, Jochebed, defied Pharaoh's orders. She didn't just let her son be thrown into the river like Pharaoh had commanded. Instead, she took a bold step of faith. She hid Moses for 3 months, doing everything she could to protect him. And when it became too dangerous, she placed him in a basket and set him afloat on the Nile River, trusting that God would intervene. Now imagine the fear and hope mixed in her heart as she let go of that basket. Was she risking his life? Or was she trusting God's plan? That moment is profound for us because it teaches us that sometimes Our greatest acts of faith come when we feel the least in control. Jochebed couldn't see the full picture, but she trusted that God would be with Moses. Her faith in God's protection changed the course of history, and God did protect Moses. The Pharaoh's daughter found him, took him in, and raised him as her own. But even in the palace, Moses wasn't forgotten by God. Though he lived in the lap of luxury, surrounded by wealth and comfort, he never forgot his roots. He knew he was Hebrew, and the injustice that his people endured burned within him. How many of us can relate to that feeling of being in one place but longing to be somewhere else, knowing deep down that we are meant for something more? Moses had it all: status, wealth, and comfort. But his heart was troubled, and he could never shake the call to stand up for his people. That deep calling was planted in him from the beginning. Moses' life is a reminder that no matter where we come from, no matter our circumstances, God has a purpose for us. Maybe you feel insignificant or forgotten, or maybe life feels out of control. But remember, just like Moses, you were born for a purpose. You may not see it yet, but God is already working behind the scenes. He's preparing you, equipping you, and positioning you for something greater than you can imagine. Trust that His plan is unfolding, even when you can't see the whole picture. Part 2, the burning bush, a call to action. Have you ever had a moment where you felt God was calling you to do something? Something big, something outside your comfort zone? Maybe you've heard God's voice in your heart, telling you to step up and take action. But instead of feeling excited, you felt completely unqualified, scared, and unsure of what to do next. This is exactly where Moses found himself when he encountered God at the burning bush. After years of living in exile in Midian, tending sheep for his father-in-law, Moses was just going through the motions. He had fled Egypt years earlier after killing an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew slave. Moses probably thought that part of his life was over. He had resigned himself to a quiet life, far from the throne and the kingdom he had once known. But God had other plans. One day, as Moses was out in the wilderness, something strange happened. He saw a bush burning, but it wasn't being consumed by the fire. Intrigued, he approached, not knowing that this would be the moment his entire life would change. Then God spoke. The voice of the Almighty, the creator of the universe, called out to Moses from the burning bush, "Moses! Moses!" Can you imagine what that must have felt like, standing before a burning bush, hearing the voice of God calling your name? It's one thing to read this story in the Bible, but think about it for a moment. What would you do if you encountered God in such a dramatic way? Moses' first response was to take off his sandals, for the ground he was standing on was holy. God was about to speak, and Moses needed to prepare his heart. Then God gave Moses a divine commission. He said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them. And now I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Exodus 3, verse 7 to 10. Now pause for a second and consider Moses' reaction. This wasn't just any task God was giving him. This was huge. Moses wasn't a trained leader, nor was he someone with great power or influence. He was a man who had failed in Egypt, who had run away to escape his past, and now God was asking him to go back and confront Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler in the world at that time. Moses had doubts. He questioned his abilities, his qualifications, and his worthiness for the task. He said, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Exodus 3, verse 11. Doesn't this sound familiar? How many times have you felt God nudging you towards something greater, but you've hesitated because you didn't feel qualified? Who am I to lead? Who am I to speak? Who am I to make a difference? These were the very thoughts that ran through Moses' mind. He wasn't sure he was the right person for the job. He felt inadequate, just like many of us do when God calls us to something big. But here's the beauty of this story. God didn't call Moses based on his qualifications. He didn't choose him because of his past success or because he was the most eloquent speaker. He chose Moses because of God's own calling and purpose. And this is the same reason God calls us today. It's not about what we can do. It's about what God can do through us. God didn't leave Moses in his doubt and fear. He reassured him, "I will be with you." Exodus 3:12. God's presence was all Moses needed. And this is the truth we need to hold on to. When God calls you to something, He doesn't expect you to do it in your own strength. He promises to be with you every step of the way. He doesn't need your perfection. He needs your willingness to trust Him. Moses' response was hesitant, full of doubt, and filled with questions. But through it all, God's answer remained the same. I will be with you. When you feel God calling you to step out in faith, know this: you are not alone. Just like Moses, you may have doubts. You may wonder if you're the right person for the task. But remember that God's presence is enough. He will guide you, equip you, and empower you. The journey won't be easy, but with Him by your side, you will find the courage to move forward. Part 3. Returning to Egypt. Trusting God's timing. Imagine Moses standing in front of the burning bush, shaking in his sandals, with a heart full of doubt. God had just given him the most impossible mission: return to Egypt and confront Pharaoh, demanding that he free the Israelites. Moses was no longer the young, bold man who had lived in Egypt's palace. He had become a humble shepherd, far removed from the opulence of Egypt's throne. But God wasn't looking for someone perfect. He was looking for someone willing to trust in His timing and obedience. And that was Moses. So what did Moses do? He obeyed, but not without hesitation. First, he tried to excuse himself, giving every reason why he wasn't the right man for the job. What if they don't believe me? Moses asked. What if they think I'm just some wanderer who has lost his mind? How often do we do the same? When God calls us to something big, our first instinct is often to doubt. We think of all the reasons why we can't do it: our weaknesses, our failures, or our perceived lack of skills. But notice what God says to Moses. What is that in your hand? Exodus 4:2. Moses had a simple staff, a humble, everyday object that he used to tend sheep. But with God's power, that staff became a tool for miracles. God told Moses to throw it down, and when he did, it turned into a snake. Then God told him to pick it back up, and it turned back into a staff. This was a sign of God's power, showing Moses that it wasn't about his abilities, it was about God working through him. God wasn't concerned with Moses' qualifications. He was concerned with Moses' willingness to obey. And just like Moses, we too need to trust that God can use whatever we have in our hands. You don't need to wait until you feel ready or perfect. If God has called you to something, He will equip you along the way. Eventually, Moses obeyed God's command and set out to return to Egypt. But the journey was not going to be easy. Moses had been away for 40 years. Egypt was the place where he had failed, where he had killed a man in defense of an Israelite and had to flee for his life. Going back wasn't just about confronting Pharaoh. It was also about confronting his own past. What would the Israelites think of him? Would they even trust him after all these years? Would Pharaoh take him seriously? But here's the crucial point. God's timing is perfect. Moses may have had doubts, but God had a plan. The Israelites were suffering, and their cries had reached God's ears. He had already prepared Moses, and now it was time for Moses to step into the role he had been chosen for. And even though Moses was filled with fear and uncertainty, God's promises stood firm. He would be with him every step of the way. Isn't that reassuring? When God calls us to something, He doesn't leave us to figure it out on our own. His timing and His plan are always perfect, even when we can't see it yet. Sometimes, like Moses, we need to take that first step in obedience, trusting that God will provide everything we need along the way. Part 4. The 10 Plagues, God's Power Revealed. So now Moses has returned to Egypt. He has faced his fears, and with the support of his brother Aaron, he goes before Pharaoh with the bold message, "Let my people go." Exodus 5:1. But Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and he refuses to release the Israelites. In fact, things get worse. Pharaoh increases the Israelites' burdens, making their lives even more difficult. The people cry out in despair, and Moses is discouraged. God, you told me to do this. Why is it getting worse? Have you ever been in a situation where you followed God's call, but instead of things getting better, they seem to get harder? It's easy to lose heart when things don't go according to plan. But what we must remember, and what Moses had to learn, is that God is always working, even when we can't see it. After Moses' initial failure, God responds in an incredible way. He tells Moses to go back to Pharaoh, and this time, the stakes are higher. Moses was to deliver a series of plagues that would demonstrate God's power, judgment, and sovereignty. The plagues weren't just random acts of destruction, they were a direct confrontation with the gods of Egypt. Each plague was a sign that God was in control, showing Pharaoh and the Egyptians that their false gods had no power in comparison to the one true God. The first plague turned the Nile River into blood. It wasn't just water that was turned to blood. It was a blow to Egypt's entire economy and way of life. The Nile was considered sacred in Egypt, the lifeblood of the nation. But God demonstrated his authority over even their most revered symbol of power. And then came the frogs, the gnats, the flies, the livestock diseases, and more. Each time Pharaoh hardened his heart, God escalated the plagues. He sent thunder, hail, and locusts, and then darkness covered Egypt for 3 days. Through each plague, God made it clear, he is the Almighty, and there is no one like him. Can you imagine the intensity of the moment? Pharaoh's magicians tried to replicate the plagues, but every time they failed. The plagues became more and more severe, and Pharaoh's pride and stubbornness led to greater suffering for his people. But even in the midst of all of this, God showed mercy to the Israelites, protecting them from the worst of the plagues. There's a powerful lesson here for us. God's power is beyond measure, and he can use any circumstance, no matter how bleak, to accomplish his purposes. Sometimes we may find ourselves in difficult situations, whether it's a challenge at work, a broken relationship, or personal struggle. But remember this, God is bigger than any obstacle, and he is always working in the background, even when we can't see it. Moses' obedience to God was pivotal. Despite the failures, despite the opposition, Moses never gave up. His faith in God's power kept him moving forward, and that's what we must do too. Continue to stand firm in the face of adversity, knowing that God is in control and that his power is greater than anything we could imagine. Part 5. The Exodus, Freedom at Last. After a series of devastating plagues, Pharaoh's heart remains hard. But finally, after the 10th and most horrific plague, the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh is broken. He has no choice but to release the Israelites. Go, Pharaoh says. And for the first time in over 400 years, the Israelites are set free. Can you imagine the joy, the relief, and the overwhelming sense of freedom the Israelites must have felt? For generations, they had been slaves in Egypt, bound by fear, oppression, and a life of hardship. But now, in the blink of an eye, God had delivered them. They were no longer bound by Pharaoh's rule. They were free. But here's the thing. Freedom doesn't always look the way we think it should. God didn't lead the Israelites on the shortest path to the Promised Land. Instead, he led them through the wilderness. There was a reason for this. God knew that the Israelites weren't ready for the challenges of the Promised Land yet. They had been slaves for so long that they needed time to learn how to trust him, how to rely on his provision, and how to become a people who lived in covenant with him. And so the Israelites began their journey through the desert. They were free, yes, but that didn't mean the road ahead would be easy. In fact, it would be filled with challenges, questions, and moments of doubt. As Moses led them out of Egypt, they encountered one of the most dramatic miracles in the Bible. Pharaoh changed his mind and sent his army after them. The Israelites found themselves trapped between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea. In that moment, everything seemed hopeless. But then God told Moses to stretch out his staff over the sea, and he parted the waters, allowing the Israelites to cross on dry land. Can you imagine standing there, watching the waters of the Red Sea parting before you, creating a dry path for you to walk on? It was a moment of pure awe, a testament to God's power and faithfulness. When the Israelites stepped onto the dry ground and saw the waters behind them, they had no doubt that God had done something miraculous. As they crossed to the other side, Pharaoh's army pursued them, but when the Israelites reached the far shore, God told Moses to stretch his staff over the water again, and the waters returned, drowning Pharaoh's entire army. In that moment, the Israelites were free, not just from Egypt, but from the threat of oppression. God had protected them, delivered them, and proven his faithfulness in an unforgettable way. What does this miracle mean for us today? Just like the Israelites, we may find ourselves facing impossible situations. We may feel trapped with nowhere to go. But when we trust God, he has the power to part the waters in our lives and make a way where there seems to be no way. Our freedom, spiritual and emotional, isn't just a one-time event. It's a continual journey. God doesn't just bring us out of oppression. He leads us into new life, new hope, and new opportunities. For the Israelites, the miracle of the Red Sea was just the beginning. The journey was far from over, but this powerful moment marked a turning point. They were no longer slaves. They were free people with a new identity in God. And as they would learn over the coming years, that freedom came with a responsibility to trust in God, follow His leading, and live according to His will. Part 6, The Wilderness Journey, Lessons in Trust and Provision. After the miracle of the Red Sea, the Israelites were ecstatic. They sang songs of praise, thanking God for His deliverance. But soon the excitement began to wear off. The reality of life in the wilderness set in. The desert was not an easy place. There was no food, no water, and the journey ahead seemed long and uncertain. The people began to complain. They were hungry, tired, and afraid. "Why did you bring us out here to die?" they cried. "At least in Egypt, we had food and water. What is this place?" Exodus team. Now I want to stop here for a moment. How often do we act the same way? We see God do something amazing in our lives and we celebrate His goodness. But then, when things get tough, when life feels uncertain and our circumstances don't line up with our expectations, we begin to doubt. We wonder if God has forgotten us, or worse, if He ever really had a plan for us to begin with. But here's the key. God doesn't promise a life free from hardship. In fact, He often leads us into places of uncertainty where our faith is tested. The wilderness isn't a punishment. It's a part of God's perfect plan to teach us to trust in Him fully. In the wilderness, God tested the Israelites. He didn't lead them into the desert to abandon them. He led them there to reveal Himself to them in powerful ways. The wilderness was where they learned to depend on God's provision. Every morning, God sent manna, bread from heaven, to feed them. And when they were thirsty, He told Moses to strike a rock, and water would pour out to satisfy their thirst. At first, it seems like the people were constantly complaining, and yet God never abandoned them. Even when they doubted, He provided. He sent manna every day, and even when they didn't have the strength to carry on, He gave them exactly what they needed. Man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Deuteronomy 8:3. In the wilderness, God was teaching the Israelites to trust in His word. His promises were more reliable than anything they could see, touch, or taste. But there was a catch. God provided just enough each day. The manna wouldn't last beyond the day. They had to gather it every morning and trust that God would provide again the next day. And on the sixth day, they were to gather twice as much because God promised to provide rest on the seventh day. This was a lesson in trust and obedience. They couldn't stockpile manna or rely on their own strength. They had to rely on God alone. It's easy to look at the Israelites and wonder why they complained so much. After all, they had just witnessed incredible miracles. But when we put ourselves in their shoes, we realize how much they were being asked to trust. And maybe, just maybe, we can see ourselves in them. In the wilderness, God isn't just about meeting our needs. He's about developing our faith. He's about showing us that He is trustworthy. Even when we don't see the way forward, even when the path ahead seems uncertain, God is still there, providing and leading. So, what can we learn from the Israelites' journey through the wilderness? In our own lives, we'll face seasons of uncertainty, struggle, and waiting. It's in those moments that we have the opportunity to trust God. We may not have all the answers, and then things may not always go according to plan. But God is faithful. Just as He provided manna and water in the wilderness, He will provide for us. And in the process, He's teaching us to trust Him more deeply. Part 7. The 10 Commandments. God's law as a guide for life. After experiencing the miraculous deliverance from Egypt and witnessing God's provision in the wilderness, the Israelites had come to a pivotal moment in their journey. They were now at the foot of Mount Sinai, a sacred mountain where God had led them to prepare them for something monumental. This wasn't just another stop on their journey. It was a moment when God was about to reveal His character, His holiness, and His standards for living. And the message He gave them would be the foundation for their identity as His people. Moses ascended the mountain, and there God spoke to him and gave him the Ten Commandments, his law for the people of Israel. These commandments weren't just a set of rules, they were a blueprint for living in relationship with God and with one another. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Exodus 20, verse 2. This opening statement is crucial. God begins by reminding the Israelites of who He is, the God who delivered them, and it's this relationship with Him that forms the foundation of His law. The commandments were not arbitrary rules, but a reflection of God's holiness and His desire for His people to live in harmony with His will. The Ten Commandments are divided into two sections, the first focusing on loving God and the second focusing on loving others. The first four commandments speak directly to our relationship with God. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourselves an idol. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. These commandments establish God's supremacy in our lives. He is the only true God, and we are to worship Him alone. But it's not just about worship. It's about living with reverence for Him, respecting His name, and recognizing that the Sabbath, a day of rest, is a gift from God to restore our bodies and souls. The second set of commandments speaks to our relationships with others. Honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet. These commandments are about living in community with others. They teach us respect, integrity, and love. These laws weren't just about making sure society functioned well. They were about reflecting God's character to the world around us. God gave these commandments not just as a moral code, but as a way of life. He knew that the Israelites needed a clear standard to live by. They were no longer slaves in Egypt. They were now a free people, and with freedom comes responsibility. They were called to be a holy nation, a people who reflected God's justice, mercy, and love. For us today, the Ten Commandments are still relevant. They are not just ancient laws. They are timeless principles that guide us in our relationship with God and with others. The heart of the commandments is this: love God and love others. Jesus Himself affirmed this in the New Testament when He said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind." This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. Matthew 22:37-39. In our fast-paced world, it's easy to overlook these commands, but when we truly grasp their significance, we realize that they are not burdensome, they are life-giving. They teach us how to live in a way that honors God and brings peace and harmony to our relationships with others. Moses received these commandments not just for himself, but for all of Israel. And it was through these laws that the Israelites would learn how to live as God's chosen people, set apart from the nations around them. Part 8. Moses' leadership, a model for us all. Moses' journey of faith wasn't just about his personal walk with God. It was also about the leadership role he was called to. Over and over again, Moses demonstrated what it means to be a servant leader, someone who leads by example and follows God's guidance, even when it's difficult. Moses was a reluctant leader at first. He didn't want the responsibility. He doubted his abilities. He feared failure. But as he walked in obedience to God's call, Moses grew into one of the greatest leaders the world has ever known. His leadership wasn't based on power, status, or skill. It was rooted in his dependence on God and his willingness to serve. What can we learn from Moses' leadership? 1. Servant leadership. One of the most striking aspects of Moses' leadership was his humility. He didn't lead with authority or a desire for power. Instead, he led with a servant's heart. Even when the Israelites grumbled and complained, Moses didn't respond with anger or authority. He interceded for them before God, asking for mercy on their behalf. Moses cared more about the well-being of his people than his own comfort or status. In Exodus 32, when the Israelites made the golden calf and turned to idolatry, Moses could have easily turned his back on them. But instead, he pleaded with God, asking for forgiveness on their behalf. Moses said to God, "But now, please forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." Exodus 32:32. Moses' heart for his people is an example of what true leadership looks like. It's not about being the boss or having all the answers. It's about caring for those you lead and being willing to sacrifice for them. 2. Intercession and prayer. Moses was also a great intercessor. He stood in the gap between God and the people of Israel, praying for their forgiveness and guidance. His prayer life was deeply connected to his leadership. When the people sinned, Moses didn't simply reprimand them. He went to God on their behalf. This reminds us that leadership is not about our own strength, but about relying on God. It's about praying for those we lead and seeking God's wisdom and direction in all things. 3. Leading with patience. Leadership often requires patience, and Moses exemplified this trait time and time again. The Israelites were constantly complaining, doubting, and testing God, but Moses didn't give up on them. He knew that his role was to guide them, even through their stubbornness. He led them through 40 years of wilderness wandering, knowing that the promised land was ahead, even when they couldn't see it. As leaders in our own lives, we must have patience with those we lead, whether it's our family, friends, or coworkers. People will make mistakes, they will question, they will doubt. But like Moses, we must be willing to guide them with patience, always pointing them toward God's promises. 4. Humility in leadership. Moses was not a perfect leader. He made mistakes, one of the most notable being when he struck the rock in anger rather than speaking to it as God had commanded. Yet, in his humility, Moses accepted God's discipline and didn't let it derail his mission. He understood that his leadership was not about him, but about fulfilling God's will. Moses' example of humility reminds us that leadership is not about seeking glory or recognition. It's about humbly serving God and others, and recognizing that any success we achieve is because of God's grace. Moses' leadership wasn't about power or prestige. It was about humility, service, and trust in God. As we reflect on his example, we are challenged to lead in the same way. Whether we are leading our families, our communities, or our workplaces, we are called to be servant leaders who rely on God's strength and guidance. In the end, Moses' leadership was not just about guiding a nation. It was about pointing them to God and helping them grow in their relationship with Him. And this is the heart of true leadership, leading others toward God's promises, His provision, and His purpose. Part 9. The Promised Land, the end of Moses' journey. After years of wilderness wandering, grumbling, and trials, the Israelites had finally arrived at the borders of the Promised Land. Their journey of freedom and faith had brought them to the edge of the land God had promised to their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was a land flowing with milk and honey, a land that had been the vision and hope of generations. And now Moses was standing at the threshold of that promise, with the entire nation looking to him as their leader. But as we know, the story wasn't going to unfold exactly as the Israelites had hoped. Moses had faithfully led them through years of hardship and uncertainty, yet when they finally reached the Promised Land, he wasn't allowed to enter it himself. Moses' final days are filled with profound lessons about faith, obedience, and trusting in God's plan, even when things don't go the way we expect. In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses, now an older man, addresses the people of Israel one last time. He reminds them of God's faithfulness, of His promises, and of the importance of following His commands. In Deuteronomy 31, God speaks to Moses and tells him that he will not enter the Promised Land, but that Joshua will take up the mantle of leadership. This was a bittersweet moment for Moses. After all he had sacrificed, after all the trials he had endured, he would not set foot in the land that he had longed to see. But even in that moment, Moses didn't turn inward or complain. He entrusted the future to God's plan and obediently passed the leadership to Joshua. It's a powerful moment in the narrative, and it speaks volumes about Moses' character. He had led the people with faithfulness, courage, and humility, and now, even in the face of his own disappointment, he chose to trust that God's plan was still good. Moses knew that his purpose wasn't about entering the Promised Land. It was about preparing the people for the journey that was still ahead. This moment in Moses' life challenges us all. Sometimes we may feel like we've worked so hard, sacrificed so much, and yet the things we long for seem just out of reach. But Moses' example teaches us that our lives are not just about achieving personal goals or reaching earthly destinations. It's about being faithful in the moment, trusting God's plan, and passing on the torch to the next generation. Moses' life was a life of preparation, preparing the people of Israel to live in covenant with God, preparing them for the challenges of the land ahead, and preparing them for the ultimate promise of a Savior. Moses' journey didn't end when he didn't enter the promised land. It continued through the lives of those he had led and mentored. Moses' final words to the Israelites were full of encouragement. He reminded them to be strong and courageous, not to fear or be dismayed, because God would always be with them. Moses knew that the Israelites would face challenges in the land, but he wanted them to trust God in every moment. As Moses passed the leadership to Joshua, he was confident that the promises of God would be fulfilled, even if he didn't get to see it with his own eyes. Sometimes, our role in life is to prepare the way for others, to invest in the future even when we can't see the full picture. Moses didn't let his own personal disappointment cloud his faith in God's greater plan. Part 10, Moses' Final Days, A Life Well Lived. Moses' death is one of the most poignant moments in the Bible. He climbed to the top of Mount Nebo, where God showed him the promised land, far in the distance, just within view, but just out of reach. And there on the mountain, Moses died at the age of 120. The Bible tells us that Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak nor his strength gone. Deuteronomy 34:7. God had given him strength and vitality all the way to the end. And yet, even in his final days, Moses remained obedient to God's plan. What strikes me the most about Moses' death is the quietness of it. There is no grand funeral procession, no elaborate memorial. Moses' death is marked by the fact that God himself buried him in an undisclosed location. No one knows where Moses was buried, not even to this day. It's as if Moses' legacy was not in the land he would never set foot in, but in the people he had raised up, the faith he had instilled in them, and the promises of God that he had passed on. Moses' life was a life well lived, not because he achieved personal greatness, but because he faithfully obeyed God's call, even in the face of difficulty, disappointment, and opposition. He was a man who knew his purpose and was willing to sacrifice everything for it. He led by example, lived with integrity, and pointed the people of Israel to the God who had promised them a future. His life wasn't about fame or glory. It was about being faithful to the God who had called him. And now, as Moses stood on the mountaintop and looked out at the promised land, he could rest in the knowledge that his mission had been accomplished. The people were ready to enter, and though he would not be the one to lead them in, his legacy would continue through Joshua and the generations to come. This is where Moses' story speaks to each of us. Our lives may not unfold as we expect. We may not always get to see the fulfillment of all the promises we've been waiting for, but we can rest in the knowledge that if we live a life of faithfulness, obedience, and trust in God's timing, our legacy will not be measured by the destinations we reach, but by the faith we leave behind. God's call on Moses' life wasn't just about the things he did. It was about the way he trusted God's plan and faithfully followed it, even when it was hard. And just like Moses, we too are called to live with that same trust, that same faith, and that same dedication to God's purpose. As we reflect on Moses' life, we can ask ourselves, are we living in faithful obedience to the call God has placed on our lives? Are we trusting his timing, even when things don't unfold the way we hope? And most importantly, are we leaving a legacy of faith that will carry forward to those who come after us? Moses' life was a testament to God's faithfulness, and it reminds us that our lives too can be part of his bigger story. Whether we reach the promised land ourselves or pass the torch to others, we are called to live lives of faith, trusting in God's promises and believing that he will be with us every step of the way. Part 11, the lasting promise, the ever-present promise of God. Moses' life is one of transformation, a story that spans from oppression to deliverance, from doubt to faith, from failure to obedience. But perhaps the most powerful part of Moses' journey is the fact that, even in his final days, the legacy of his faithfulness continued to echo throughout history. Though Moses did not enter the promised land himself, his life pointed to something far greater than any physical inheritance or destination, the enduring, unbreakable promises of God. The Israelites stood on the edge of the land God had promised to their ancestors. They had been through so much, years of slavery, decades in the wilderness, and countless trials, and yet God had remained faithful to his word. Even though Moses was not there to lead them in, his final words and his example set the foundation for their future. Before his death, Moses gave the people of Israel one final command and one final promise: to be strong and courageous, to remember that God would always be with them, no matter what lay ahead. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Deuteronomy 31:6. This promise echoes through the ages and speaks directly to us today. As we face the challenges of our own lives, we are reminded that God's presence is always with us. He has not abandoned us, and he will never forsake us. His promises are just as true now as they were for the Israelites standing on the edge of the promised land. When we look at Moses' life, we see the consistency of God's faithfulness throughout the generations. Moses may not have entered the land, but he knew that God's promises would be fulfilled in the lives of the people. He trusted that, even in his absence, the work God had begun would continue. And the same is true for us. Our lives, like Moses' life, are part of a much bigger story, a story that extends beyond our own time and beyond our own circumstances. As we reflect on Moses' journey, we are reminded of the profound truth that God keeps his promises, no matter how long it takes for them to come to fruition. From the promise of deliverance from Egypt to the promise of a land flowing with milk and honey, and ultimately to the promise of a Savior, God's plan was unfolding in ways that Moses could not have fully understood in his lifetime. But his faithfulness to God, his obedience, and his trust in God's timing laid the foundation for all that was to come. Moses' life points forward to Jesus Christ, the ultimate fulfillment of God's promises. Just as Moses led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, Jesus came to lead us out of the slavery of sin. Moses delivered God's law to the people, but Jesus came to fulfill the law and bring us into a new covenant. Where Moses led God's people through the wilderness, Jesus leads us through the wilderness of life with his guidance, his mercy, and his love. Moses' life is a testament to the power of God's faithfulness and the lasting impact of a life lived in obedience. And when we too live in obedience, trusting God's promises and relying on his presence, we become part of the same story. Like Moses, we are called to lead others in faith, to trust in God's plan, and to leave a legacy that will continue long after we're gone. Conclusion: a life of faith, leadership, and God's promise. As we come to the end of Moses' story, we are left with a profound sense of awe at the way God worked in his life and at the way God continues to work in ours. Moses' life was marked by faith, leadership, and an unwavering trust in the promises of God, and these same qualities are available to us today. Moses was an unlikely hero. He was a man who stumbled in his faith, who doubted God's calling on his life, and who faced countless obstacles. Yet, despite his flaws and imperfections, Moses remained faithful to the calling God placed on his life. And because of his faithfulness, God used him to lead an entire nation to freedom. We may not be called to lead a nation, but we are all called to trust God's plan for our lives. Like Moses, we all face moments of doubt, fear, and uncertainty, but we also have the same assurance Moses had, that God is with us, that his promises are true, and that he will never leave us. Moses' journey reminds us that faith is not about having all the answers or being perfect. It's about trusting God, even when the path ahead seems unclear. Leadership is not about being in control or having all the power. It's about serving others with humility, pointing them to the promises of God, and leading by example. And God's promise is always faithful, no matter the circumstances, no matter the time. As you reflect on the life of Moses, ask yourself, how can I trust God more fully? How can I serve others with humility and faith? How can I leave a legacy that points others to the promises of God? The story of Moses is a reminder that God's promises never fail. He is always with us, always faithful, and always working out his plan for our lives. And no matter where we are on our journey, we can trust that he will carry us to the places he has promised, just as he did for Moses and the Israelites. So, as you continue on your own journey, remember that God is with you. He has called you for a purpose, and his promises will stand forever. Be strong, be courageous, and know that the same God who was faithful to Moses is faithful to you. The promise of God is ever present. It never fades, and his faithfulness to his people endures forever.